Okay, I think we will get started. So it is 6:30. Hello and welcome everyone to our New to Your Neighbors webinar, What You Need to Know About Amendment 1. I am Beth Feely, president of New to Your Neighbors, which is a grassroots citizens group based here in the north suburbs of Chicago. And among our interests is seeing common sense policy in state and local government. You can find out more about New to Your Neighbors at our website, newtoyourneighbors.org. And please do sign up for our email newsletter, which is the best way to stay in touch with us about programs such as this. So speaking of common sense in government, there is a proposed amendment to the Illinois Constitution that will be on the ballot on November 8th. And it has the potential to make virtually permanent the ability of public sector unions influence policy in Illinois. And so to help you better understand this issue, Amendment 1, and so you can make an informed decision, we have asked Ted Dabrowski of Wirepoints.org to talk to us about this proposed amendment. Ted is president of Wirepoints, which reports on Illinois finances and education, and he is also a fellow board member with me here at New to Your Neighbors. So Ted is going to present to us for about 15 minutes about this proposed amendment, and then we will have plenty of time for audience questions after his presentation. For those questions, you can use the chat function and enter them there. I will keep track of them and we'll be sure to address them towards the end of the presentation. So with that, we welcome Ted Dabrowski.
Beth, thank you for having me on and letting me share some of this information on Amendment 1. This amendment is probably the most important vote on the ballot in November, and most people don't know about it. They kind of snuck it up on us, but to get this on the ballot, it took two-thirds of, or 3/5 of the legislature to actually vote it in. It was voted both by Republicans and Democrats, so it's on the ballot, and it's because it has an impact on the Constitution, because it amends the Constitution. It has lasting impacts, and more so than a vote for a governor, or a vote for a representative. So it behooves everybody to really understand what this is. And if you care about property taxes, if you care about parents' rights, and if you care about union powers, then this is an amendment you'll really want to pay attention to. So I put together a few slides that kind of take us through what Amendment 1 is. But before I do that, I'm going to just pull up a presentation here. And before I do that, let me just get it set up right. So before I do that, I think it's really important to kind of outline where Illinois is in some of the big issues before people consider whether to vote for this thing or not. The first thing you should understand is that Illinois has the nation's highest property taxes. That's starting point number one. And if you understand anything about union powers in the public, and I'm talking about public sector union powers in particular, when you understand that, and we have the highest property taxes in the nation, you'll understand why this is important. Our property taxes are almost 2% of our home values in Illinois, highest in the country, as I've mentioned. And when you compare that to some of our neighboring states, Indiana is down here at 0.8%. So they pay half the taxes that we pay. So this is an important point to consider. Another point that's important is we have the nation's biggest pension debts in the country by far. $313 billion is what Moody's says the state pension debt is, the pension hole. So you can imagine that to fill that, taxes are going to have to go up a lot. And of course, there's a big correlation between public sector government union powers and their benefits. We've given away some of the biggest benefits in the country. And you can see here, we have more debt than California and Texas, which are the next two states, and they're much bigger than we are. So on a per capita basis, we have a lot of pension debts. The problems that we're having in Illinois have meant that our nest eggs, most people have their savings or nest eggs in their homes. Well, our home values in the last 20 years have not grown at all. When you adjust for inflation, Illinois home values are up only 3% over a 20-year period. Compare that to the rest of the country. We've laid out all 50 states in this graphic. You don't need to understand where each one is. What you need to know is that Illinois is on the far left, on the bad end. But you've got other states where people are seeing over the last 20 years 60 and 70 and 50% growth in their home value. So their nest eggs, their retirements have grown nicely. Ours have been stagnant. All those bad policies have left Illinois shrinking And when you look at people moving into Illinois versus people moving out of Illinois over the last 20 years, on a net basis, we've lost 1.4 million people on net over those 20 years. Only New York and California have done worse than we have. On the other end of the extreme, Florida's gained 2.5 million people in those 20 years. Texas has gained 2 million people. So, people are being attracted to places where there's growth, where there's not too much debt, where taxes are lower, where home values go up. So we are on the wrong end of the stick on this one. And last way to kind of measure where we are is kind of think of credit score. People are used to seeing credit scores, when they buy a house or when they buy a car, they need to have a good credit score. Well, same thing for states. And Moody's measures the credit score for states. And Moody's finds Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, our neighboring states, they're AAA rated states. That's the pristine credit. They're their best credits. Those are the states that banks like to lend to. Where's Illinois on this thing? Dead last in the country. Chicago is already a junk rated state. That means that you're pretty risky credit. And Illinois was almost a junk rated state, but then those $200 billion in federal COVID aid for the private and public sectors bailed out the state. But we're still at the bottom of the heap, even lower than New Jersey. So this is the condition we're in as we think about Amendment 1. And I think the best way to kind of tell you what Amendment 1 is to break the amendment language into three pieces. Let me explain that. So the first part, what it does is cements the union powers. Illinois, before Amendment 1, Illinois already gives its unions some of the biggest powers in the country to negotiate, to bargain, to strike, all those kind of things. We're on the extreme end of giving our unions, public sector unions, powers. What this amendment would do is take those government union powers and cement them into the Constitution. And it also gives them new rights as well. So here's what the language says. Workers' rights. And I'm going to focus on public sector. This stuff doesn't apply to the private sector, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Employees shall have the fundamental right to organize and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing for the purpose of negotiating wages, hours, and working conditions, and this is important, and to protect their economic welfare and safety at work. So not only are we going to put that fundamental right into the Constitution on par with freedom of speech and freedom of religion, we're also going to give them new rights called economic welfare and safety. So now whatever they deem in negotiations as impacting their economic welfare, so imagine any kind of reform that would lower government costs and maybe impact some of the workers, some of their benefits, they'll be able to say, you can't touch that. That's in the Constitution. Or if it says something that affects their safety, then they'll say, you can't touch that. That's in the Constitution. My rights are protected. So these unions will have the most powers in the country, government unions. Now, some people want that. And if you're a person looking for the unions to have even more powers than they have today and to have the most powers in the country, this is an amendment for you. But if you think the unions already have too much power and that they influence too much government policy, then this, of course, would be something you would oppose. The second part of the language says, no laws can diminish collective bargaining rights. So not only are they putting the power to negotiate and these rights and this economic welfare and safety in the Constitution, they also add the language that says, no law shall be passed that interferes with, negates, or diminishes the right of employees to negotiate and bargain over all those things we talked about. Now think about that. That means that not only is it in the Constitution, but the legislature can no longer pass laws that impact those rights. So if they wanted to do something to lower property taxes, the unions could say, the government unions could say, hey, look, in the Constitution, you can't pass any laws that do that. If you wanted to consolidate some school districts and lower the cost for taxpayers, they'd say, you're impacting my economic welfare and you can't pass laws that do that. Or it might be something like they're concerned about their safety. Let's take a teachers union and they say, we want masks in school, or we want vaccinations or something like that. And they say, it protects us, it's our safety. We want it in the contract, and they negotiate it. Well, guess what? Lawmakers can't pass a law to break that, to stop that. So,
and just to jump in, those negotiations take place in secret. And so we are not privy to how those negotiations largely go. Is that true?
That's correct. We're one of 10 states, Beth, 10 states in the country where the negotiations between the unions and the administration or the government, it's secret. And the public only finds out about the results of those negotiations after it's signed. And so it's funny, just recently, I forget which school district it was, had just completed negotiations with the union. And it came out in the press saying they have completed the negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. And at the very end of the article, details of the agreement will be released after the contract is signed. So that means the public has no idea what's been given away until after the fact. And that could be the case with any of the things we've just talked about, whether it's CRT or sex ed or masking or things like that. And then the third part here is blocks right to work. So this is the one part of the amendment that impacts the private sector. Otherwise, it has no impact on the private sector. So right to work laws in states that are right to work, that means that a worker in the private sector has a choice between joining a union or not. It's up to that person. So it's not a condition of employment. In Illinois right now, if you're in a place that has a union and you want to work there, you have to join the union. You have to pay the union dues. So we're not a right to work state. What this amendment would do is block Illinois from becoming a right to work state. So that means we won't ever have a chance to become more competitive. Indiana is right to work already. Wisconsin is right to work. Michigan is right to work. Kentucky's right to work. Iowa's right to work. The only state among our neighbors that's not right to work is Missouri. So this would block worker freedom to join a union or not in the private sector. The freedom has already been granted to the public sector. Janus, back in 2017, gives public sector workers the right or not to be in a union. But if this amendment passes, right to work would be blocked for the private sector. All right, so I keep talking about the government, because that's the powers that will be gained from the amendment. The private sector, many of you may have seen ads already in the TV. This is one of the ads, the first ad that came out, and it was about a private sector nurse, and he talks about him having more protections, more safety, more rights to speak up against bad hospitals that all they care about is profits and they don't care about people. They were kind of pretty negative about that. And he was saying, I need this amendment to protect my rights as a worker. Well, those claims he's making are just not true, because this amendment will have zero impact on the private sector when it comes to rights and things like that, and safety. All that is covered by federal law, and federal law trumps, it preempts, it supersedes anything that the state would do in law or in the Constitution. So the ads that you're seeing on TV are just not true. You should not believe them. What they're trying to do is rope in private sector workers to vote for the amendment by telling something that's a non-truth. Now, the amendment is written, it says workers. And so it looks like it implies that it covers all workers, but that's not the case. And I think what's important there is what the sponsor of the amendment said when it was going through committee. Senator Ram Villavalam, he was the sponsor, and he said, as federal labor law stands today, the amendment could not apply to the private sector. So those are his words, not mine. Of course, it's all been validated, and federal law supersedes anything for the private sector when it comes to this. So again, ignore the ads. So let me just wrap it up now here by saying, here's what a supporter would say about this amendment. So a supporter might say, hey, this thing creates the nation's strongest government unions, giving more power to the unions to fight for bigger compensation, more social justice programs, and additional tax revenues to pay for those things. And that would be true. It'd be even more true saying that they would have the strongest union powers in the country. They might say that this amendment vastly expands union powers, giving teacher unions, for example, the ability to enact diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculums into the contracts, sexuality education, and they'd be able to do that without the interference of parents. That's a powerful advantage the unions would have in being able to do this without parents.
And again, you referenced earlier the masking situation. The unions could say, for our workplace safety, we think everyone should be in masks, and then this would give them essentially the power to demand that.
That's right. And we've seen weak school board administrators throughout the country give in over and over again. So that could very likely be a scenario. And don't forget this. We'll come back to another point I want to make. Another point the supporter might say is this gives the public sector union rights protection similar to Illinois' pension protection clause. In the pension protection clause in the Constitution, it says that pension benefits cannot be diminished, and that covers even unearned benefits that haven't even been earned yet. So this law would say similar things, and that bargaining rights can't be diminished. So they may like that. It's more powers for them. And finally, of course, a supporter would say, look, the private sector workers can't, or Illinois' private sector can't become a right to work state. So that means Illinois will continue to have to join unions as a condition of employment. So those are what they would say. And again, if you're a person that wants to see more of these powers, if you want to see right to work blocked, this would be an amendment for you. Opponents would have maybe similar arguments, but stress different things. An opponent would say Illinois would have the most extreme public union powers in the country. No other state, and Illinois would leapfrog any other state that has strong unions. No other state gives government union powers over taxpayers like Amendment 1 would or does. An opponent might say that this amendment locks in these powers and benefits for public sector workers, and ordinary Illinoisans who don't get those benefits would be forced to pay for those public sector benefits no matter what. So it really just kills reforms. It kills the ability to reform property taxes or the drivers of property taxes. They might also say, look, Illinois has already paid the nation's highest property taxes. So with these constitutional powers for negotiation, and with the inability of lawmakers to pass laws, then if you think property taxes are high now, just wait. They're going to be a lot higher. And last is, we talked about this. COVID revealed how few rights parents have in K through 12 education. Imagine now with this amendment, what would parents' rights look like going further, especially in the areas of CRT, masks, sex ed. Beth, you and I were talking earlier. It reminded me of what Terry McAuliffe, what did he say in Virginia that maybe caused him to lose the election?
I think it was along the lines that parents really shouldn't have a say in what their children learn in school, so that they really weren't an important stakeholder.
So again, so that's not an opponent saying that. It's what Terry McAuliffe, a supporter of union rights, would say, and that I think will create a lot of fear in people. So that's what I wanted to bring up, and now we can just open up to some questions. But it's very powerful both ways, and we know that in Illinois, the unions have lots of power. And this would just give them more power. An important note is for people who vote against the amendment, it doesn't diminish any of the powers of the unions today. We just keep the status quo, which is already some of the strongest unions in the country. So a vote no wouldn't take away anything from the unions. It would just stop from giving them even more powers. So Beth, I'll turn it over for questions, or I'll clarify anything.
Great. Yes, please do submit questions into the chat. We will keep track of them and read them. And I have one, Ted, as a follow-up. It will be on the ballot as a proposed amendment. Is that correct? It's not going to be called Amendment 1 on the ballot.
Correct. I should probably go to our website and show. I'll show you this, because for whoever's interested, if you go to Wirepoints main page, there's a red button up here at the top. It says Amendment 1. And if you click on that, we break out the details of the amendment. So we break out some of the things we've said, make it more clear, some arguments for and against. And then we also show you how your legislator voted. It's surprising it was bipartisan, which is interesting in and of itself. And we have an FAQ, but down here at the very end, we have the language. And what's interesting is the amendment is not called Amendment 1 on the ballot. It's not called workers' rights. It's called, and so you'll look for this, proposed amendment to add section 25 to Article 1 of the Illinois Constitution. Is that tricky? I don't know. Then they give you the arguments in favor and against. So you'll see there, protect workers and others' safety. You'll see language like that, and some people may be confused or positively moved by it, but they should know the truth that the private sector is not covered, and it's a big amendment in favor of the public government unions.
I know I've out and about seen some signs that are, I think they're light blue and yellow, that say yes for workers' rights or something along those lines. So that would be considered a sign on the supporter side of this amendment. I have yet to see signs for the other side, but perhaps those are coming from people. So that's good to know. And is it usually placed at the beginning of the ballot, at the end of the ballot? Should people be looking, where should they be looking for this?
It's going to be at the top of the ballot, so it should be right there.
Okay. So question. Okay. Going back to the right to work issue, if Janus at a federal level gives people the right to not join unions, how can something baked into our Constitution, I guess, compel people, it sounded like, to join a union? How exactly does that work out? Because it sounds like this could potentially be unconstitutional if passed in its current form.
What the federal law does allow is it allows states to choose whether they are right or not. So
okay.
That's carved out,
Got
right,
it.
to choose, and that's why you've seen the big move towards right to work by lots of states.
Okay. So, essentially, and just to reiterate that this does not benefit private sector workers. It only benefits public sector workers. And so any claims that you're seeing are just, as you had outlined, they are not true because this just applies to public sector. So is there, go ahead.
Negative, right, Beth, but there's a negative for the private sector in that it blocks right to work. So the worker freedom for those private sector workers.
Just out of curiosity, what is the difference between what a public sector worker makes versus a private sector worker? You mentioned that essentially private sector workers will be funding essentially a lot of these benefits. Do you have any statistics on that?
So on benefits or
benefits, or I guess just overall pay. And I'm getting a note here that the chat's disabled, so I don't know. Well, I'll have to work on that. So could you, I guess, yes. Okay. So average states worker salaries. Yes. I was curious about this.
Yes. Let me show a couple of things here. First of all, so here's why the public sector has such extreme powers. Right now, the private sector, it's a very low percentage of people who are now in private unions. It's shrunk down to, I think, below 10%, where the public sector is closer to 50%. And state workers is more like 90%. So if you look at the state workers, it's really high. So there's rules like these in there. I mentioned that Illinois allows its public sector unions, its government unions, to keep contract negotiations secret. We're one of just 10 states in the country that lets that happen. So that partially is laws that are passed by politicians. It's important to note that the unions get their power from the politicians. It's when lawmakers pass favorable laws for the unions, which many times are not favorable for taxpayers, that they get these powers. So this is one example of why they're able to negotiate really good deals. Another one is, it's a lot of red there because the states are big, but there's only 13 states in the country that make strikes legal. In Illinois, we legalize our teacher strikes. None of our neighbors do. And so here's another way that the unions have power. They say, hey, listen, if we don't get what we want, we can strike. So all it takes is a threat of a strike to really increase benefits. And then a couple more things that are really important. Some states don't even let their governments negotiate with unions. So some of them banned collective bargaining altogether. It's illegal. And so, the unions can't use their power vis-a-vis the government and the administrators. So for example, South Carolina, Virginia banned collective bargaining. We're on the other extreme. Not only do we not ban collective bargaining, we actually make it compulsory. It is forced negotiation. So our school administrators, for example, have to negotiate with the unions. And if the unions don't like what they see, strikes are protected. They're legal in Illinois. So we go to the other extreme. Number 8 is also Illinois, where police and fire, for example, can't strike. That would be wrong, illegal, public safety. But they can request an outside arbitrator, an unelected official, to come in and arbitrate and choose and decide how things go. And it typically goes against the taxpayers. And there's something in between for other states. But the point is, we already have really extreme laws. And these extreme laws is one of the reasons why we have the highest property taxes in the country. And so if you look at state worker pay, this is all 50 states lined up. We're the second highest in the country. This data comes from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. So second highest in the country already. If you look at, for example, salaries over time between private sector and public sector, you can see that in the last 15 years, the pace of salary growth, I'm not even talking about the levels, although the levels are quite different, but that's a separate discussion. The pace of salary growth for public sector workers and state workers is just much, much higher than the people who pay for those salaries. So this is another issue. You can see the negotiation power. State workers are protected by government, by long-term contracts, guaranteed raises. They get the pension, guaranteed lifetime pension. They get pension pickups and sick leave benefits. So it's a really big thing, and this is why so many people are underwater. Then you. So we
do. Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have a few questions in here. So finish that up, and then we'll get a couple of these questions.
When you look at the big pensions, for example, these are the top superintendents in the state. They get lifetime pensions of $8 to $9 to $10 million. So those are the kind of things driving it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. So please do send questions to newturneighbors@gmail.com. That's our backup strategy. Ted, what would it take to repeal the pension protection clause? So that's not this, but it's the preceding law that's kind of like this.
Right. So we've struggled with that. It would take the legislature voting to create another amendment, and that amendment would have to say repeal the pension protection clause, and then Illinoisans would have to vote on it. So it's really hard. It's really hard to get an amendment on the ballot in the first place, because if the legislators don't want to put it there, then it doesn't get there. And then, of course, it would have to win the vote. So it'd be the same. If this thing passes and then we want to get rid of it, we're going to have to go have another amendment, get it on the ballot, and then vote it away.
Okay. Next, Ted, again, could you explain how the Janus SCOTUS decision is so ignored in Illinois, and why it wouldn't apply to the right to work carve out?
Well, so Janus was a big win, and and it's having an impact. This is going to take a long time, but public sector workers now have a choice not to join the unions. The question is how difficult, how difficult do the unions make it for people to opt out? First of all, people need to know that they can get out of the union. Then they have to have an ability to do so. They have to have an ability to sign up to get out. And there's a lot of rules on how that's done. And the more difficult the unions make it, the more difficult that legislation makes it, and also the more pressure that unions put on people who might opt out. That slows things down as well. So it's a long-term process. Unions are slowly losing some of that power. Not so in Illinois, but in other states. And so it's a long-term process.
Okay. Ted, what is the most problematic part of this amendment to you, if you had to name just one of the clauses?
Well, I think so. For me, I'd sum it up in that this amendment cements two classes of workers in Illinois. One class that's protected by long-term contracts, constitutional protections to bargain in for pensions, guaranteed raises, all kinds of benefits. And it creates a second class, or locks in a second class of private sector workers who don't get any of those benefits. Private sector workers don't get such benefits, and yet they would be increasingly forced to pay for the first. So that's the real problem. You're creating two classes of workers and forcing one to pay for the other. It will chase more people out of Illinois.
Okay, and let's see here. You know, for me, the subjective language also seems to be problematic. Like, how do you define safety? How do you define economic welfare? I mean, it seems to me that leaves open a very wide range of how that could be defined. And again, that, you know, people are going to have to pay for who absolutely won't enjoy necessarily the benefits or the protections that the definitions of those words would provide.
Yeah, you know, anything this broad. So, you know, one of the big arguments that Mark Glenn and my partner has been saying is that you've got all these laws, you got like 350 or, you know, who knows how many laws that are in place to manage Illinois. Well, forget all that, because the Constitution will supersede all those laws. And the language is so broad and so undefined. There's no definition. There's no laws that it points to. So, like you said, how do you define economic safety, economic welfare? How do you define safety? And God knows if the private sector workers will say, hey, it's in the Constitution, we're going to try it. And so they could create lots of chaos for the private sector as well, litigation, a lot of fights. You could have unions cropping up all over the place because it says you can create a union of your own choosing. Yeah. So, gosh, you know, if Illinois isn't already difficult enough to operate in, what will it look like tomorrow under this kind of amendment?
Okay, well, with that, we are up against our end time. We will make the recording of this session available. You can look for it at the Neutral Neighbors YouTube channel, as well as at the Wirepoints website. And also do encourage you to go to the wirepoints.org website to find that Amendment 1. You should be able to see it. Did you say up at the top?
At the top, yeah, you'll see it. Right.
Okay, and click, and you'll find a lot of the information that we talked about. And Ted, will you be able to make these slides available online for people?
Sure.
Okay, and the information there.
Yeah, the presentation will be online as well.
Okay.
Let me just say, if I could just reiterate one last point. This is a momentous vote. Everybody should be engaged. You know, there's some people who are going to want more union powers. This is their amendment. This is their vote. Others will find this very problematic, but no matter what, people should engage in it and find out and understand what it means.
Yeah, so please do share with your friends and neighbors, and please stay connected with us and tune into our next webinar. Thanks. Have a great rest of the evening.
Okay.